honesty. Whatever that means, I don't know. I should have said this is the place for intellectual, spiritual, and scriptural honesty. In other words, we're moving in that direction with people like Dr. John Shook, and he's here to host this show.
How are you this morning?
I'm doing marvelous, wonderful, except for I can't speak.
Well, today we've got a team with us, so we'll all chip in.
Sounds good.
Today we have with us Jeff Satterwhite, who comes to us from Denver, Colorado. How are you today, Jeff?
Doing well, John. Thanks.
And also joining us is Chris Mowdy, who's coming to us from Philadelphia. How are you?
I'm doing real well. Glad to be here.
All right. Well, our topic today is the Clergy Project. And we have with us Jeff Satterwhite, who's been involved with the Clergy Project perhaps almost back to the beginning. And Jeff is going to help us out with telling a bit of the story of the Clergy Project and how we got involved with it. But before we get into the Clergy Project, Jeff, why don't you tell us a little bit about back when you were a member of the clergy and your journey that brought us to this place?
Well, I grew up in the great state of Texas, in the Dallas area, and I was a Southern Baptist for years, and moved into Baptist ministry after my time at Texas A&M. I worked in several churches, a mega church, fundamentalist mega church in Austin, an associate singles minister. We had thousands of people there. It was an interesting experience, to say the least. And then I moved to a 100-year-old Baptist church in a more moderate tradition in Houston, where I was an education minister in the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, which is a bit more moderate denomination. I've moved to Denver in 2007 to start a doctoral program in religious studies. And at that point, I kind of changed to being a liberal Baptist and worked in an American Baptist church as an adult education minister in Denver. And so I kind of went from the conservative to the moderate to the liberal to the not a Christian atheist anymore, not Christian anymore atheist. So there's a long journey from bigger churches to smaller churches and then out.
You have managed to cover most of the spectrum of what it's like to be religious and non-religious in America. You zoomed all the way from one side to the other, didn't you?
I did.
Did you feel like there was sort of wind at your back? Can you describe sort of what it was like to be carried, to be swept so far?
I think it's each stage of education for me in seminary and in this doctoral program has kind of been the wind at my back to ask questions I would never ask before, to question the assumptions I had about my beliefs, about the boundaries of the cultures that I was in, and to just ask questions that I would never ask. I think each stage, the best way to describe it for me was moving from a compartmentalization of logic and evidence and that kind of thing to allowing it to go into my entire life. One of my favorite stories is when I was little, I had a detective club. And some of my friends in the neighborhood, we would go and solve mysteries in the neighborhood, which were just so profound, like lost dogs and those kinds of things. But one day we found these tire tracks going into our backyard. And I had this great little plaster of Paris kit from the Hardy Boys books and detective kit that I would read. And we went and took a plaster of Paris mold of this tire track and brought it back into the house. And we were just so convinced that someone from down in the RV park was driving motorcycles into our backyard, or the next door neighbor was driving his bike or whatever. And I went to the dinner table with this, and my dad looked at it and he said, "Let's go out to the garage for a second." And we walked out and I held it up to the lawnmower. And of course, it was the lawnmower track, not some bicyclist or motorcyclist down the street that was going into the backyard. And so in that moment, I understood what it meant to have the best solution that fits something. The most simple thing, explanation for things, is frequently the right answer. And it took me a long time to kind of allow that to permeate my theological life as well as the rest of my life.
Wow, that makes a lot of sense. You already had kind of an inquiring mind. What was it like to finally come out? And you really came out the whole way, didn't you? You didn't stop at sort of some kind of very thin liberalism, or it sounded like maybe you went through an agnostic phase, but you didn't stop with the agnostic word. You went all the way to the A word. What was that like?
Yeah, I like to call my journey a journey of both evidence and ethics. And for me, I think moving to the A word, as you called it, is kind of the ethics part. There's a quote from the play J.B. by Archibald MacLeish. And the quote was, and it's about Job and that story. If God is God, he is not good. And if God is good, he is not God. And it's kind of that classic problem of evil and that kind of thing. I got to say I moved from a God is not good theology, which I kind of realized in seminary with that conservative bent and trying to fit that to the ethics in the world and what we see around us, to a God is not God theology. As I've gone through this doctoral program and been a liberal Christian, God has gotten a little bit smaller and a little bit smaller and a little bit smaller. And the power of God reduces in that theology as you look at it, because you have to do that in order to make God ethical. So I like to say I've moved from a God is not good theology to a God is not God theology to a God is not theology.
Wow, that's a really clear way of expressing it. You firmly believe that anybody can be good without God, then?
Absolutely. I have many liberal religious friends, and I call our ethical systems are in line, and our values are similar. And I really enjoy working. I was a vice chair of a public policy commission with the Interfaith Alliance of Colorado for several years, and have enjoyed working with my friends in those ethical endeavors. That being said, I have a big problem as I study the evangelical right, where I used to be, and atonement theology, especially sacrificial atonement theology, not the kinds of atonement theologies maybe about the power structure of society or that kind of thing, but individual atonement. I've come to see it's really based on a human self-contempt or self-hatred, that kind of everything is our fault and God has no fault, and that kind of thing that I grew up with, that message that they have to instill in you in order to make that conversion. And so for me, the journey out of conservative theology was a journey to ethics, to humanist ethics even in my liberal religious identity as well as now. And so, I've studied a lot about how theologies are constructed and those kind of things. And I really believe we can inspire higher purpose without having higher powers. And so I do want to share one story that was instrumental for me in that, John.
Sure, go ahead.
When I was at Texas A&M, I went off to what they call fish camp. And fish camp is a freshman orientation. A lot of universities have it. It's pretty transformative. I like to say A&M's culture is almost like a religion. I don't believe it's a religion, but it's something else, the tradition there. And but there's that sense of communal bond and ritual and all those things. And so I went off to fish camp as a young fundamentalist, fresh out of my youth group, and we did songs and powerful things there. And it really bothered me because I felt the same feelings that I had at youth camps and religious experiences when I was a Southern Baptist. And it bothered me at the time like crazy. I'm like, they're mimicking the Holy Spirit. They're mimicking the work of what's going on that God does and all this. And it bothered me. But as I've reflected on that over time, I came to understand they created a culture. They had symbolic boundaries around it. They had a sense of identity and shared goals, and they created a culture that welcomed and provided ritual and meaning. and all those things.
Those are
to
very, very human
Yeah.
things.
Exactly. And so it was transformative to me to look back on that and go, look, you can have these things without necessarily having to have gods. And we
Right.
had values that were taught there that were important to me. And so I've seen it that these are needs that religion helps to fill in our culture and society. Are very important to people,
Right.
but we can do it without religion as well. So
You've put
Those,
that so powerfully. Go ahead, Chris.
those needs can be met in a secular way, is what you're saying.
absolutely.
So for the people that say that the good of religion is the community that it affords and the ritualistic components of it, like, you know, having some place to go on Sunday where there are people that agree with you, that you get along with, that you can commune with, and all of those trappings that, I'll use that word, I hope it doesn't have a negative connotation, but all of that, everything that surrounds it, the accoutrements of going to church, can be satisfied in a secular way just as easily. But if you don't
believe that.
if you don't mind, I'd like to jump in, and I know John, that you'd like to get to the Clergy Project, but Jeff's story is just so fascinating. I have a couple of things that I would like to
Please,
say,
go
and a
ahead,
couple of things
yes.
that I'd like to ask.
Go ahead.
The first is, what I'd like to say is I really dig how concisely you articulate the God is not good, God is not God, God is not. That transition is just beautiful. But it raises a question for me, because the way you outlined it, it pretty much looks like the more education you got, the more liberal you became on the way towards atheism. So are you a case study, or a case in point of how education pulls people away from religion? That's my first question.
Well, I would say I'm one of the only ones, and probably the only one in my program, that has reached this conclusion from the education we received. So maybe and maybe not. I don't know.
That's a great answer.
I think that I have some great friends, especially colleagues and professors, that have not reached the same conclusion as me through the education they received. But for me, I think it was breaking down that compartmentalization, like I was saying. I've had this inquiring mind, as I think John put it, for a very long time. And actually, when I went to A&M, was going into aerospace engineering, because I had this scientific side. I did well in physics in high school, and I thought that's where I wanted to go. And then that didn't quite fit with where I was going, and I switched and went into ministry, and that was an interesting move. But I think education forces us to question and to think good education. I don't think it necessarily has a prescribed endpoint. So,
Okay, that makes sense.
Okay. And the second question that I had is, it revolves around a concept that's going to take me just a second to unpack. So please humor me. When it comes to the new, when it comes to the New Covenant group, I like to think of the people that are interested in the New Covenant group, because we are a place where atheists and theists can come together to talk about the topics on the atheism-theism landscape in a civil and respectful way, right? And we consider that something that's novel. Considering, if you go on YouTube and look at atheists and theists talk to each other, if you look at forums where you see atheists and theists discuss things, or if you look at the media where they pit a fringe atheist and theist together, you don't really see a lot of communication. You see a lot of crosstalk. And so we consider ourselves a pretty special place for that. And we also consider ourselves fulfilling a thirst that exists for this kind of conversation. So a model that I play with is the idea that some people are pushed towards us because of outside forces, right? Theists could be pushed towards us because of the churches that they were in previously. Atheists could be pushed towards us because of these horrible forums or YouTube channels that they're a part of. Or people could be pulled towards us because of the ideas that we have and the goals that we have just resonate with them, and they're curious about learning more about them. I think that model applies to a bunch of different things, because I stole it from somewhere else. In your talk about going towards atheism, it sounds like you were more pushed towards atheism than you were pulled towards it. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
pushed towards.
Is that analogy making sense to you?
I think so. I'm trying to.
So in other words, it's not like you were searching and you saw atheism and you're like, oh, look at this worldview where I could like have a Chinese menu option of all these different philosophies and religions for me to choose from that I can make an eclectic worldview from. You know what I mean? That resonates with me. I'm going to move towards that. It was more like there's this act force. You talked about a wind against your back.
Yes. There. I think I would describe it less as being pushed or pulled and maybe being pushed from within.
Okay.
That there was a time you mentioned, I think John mentioned I went through an agnostic period. That's true. I think it was a period that I didn't want to use the A word or be associated with it because it's so demonized in our culture. And I think kind of realizing that's where I am and just accepting it took a little bit of time. But it was just this drive. And I know I'm going to step on some postmodernists probably with this comment, but the drive for understanding what I believe to be reality, the drive to seek what is true no matter what. And that is what drives me inside. And the label put me off for a little while, but I'm like, that's where I've come to in my own journey, and I'm going to embrace that and be there. So I think the pushing is from within for me.
Wow, that's a very sincere statement of what it was like to be you. It's almost like a drive to just really try to be honest about what you're searching for and what you expect to find. And speaking of honesty, and here I'm going to segue into the Clergy Project, you've come out, but you know that there are many ministers, clergy, priests, and so forth that are still in churches. They're still speaking from pulpits. If you could have a minute, pretend Chris and I and thousands of viewers aren't here, what would you say to that clergy person who's listening to you right now? What would you say to them? Because you know how torn they are, and you know how difficult it is.
It's very complex. I've been in various secular groups where there are. Let me say this first, John. I look at the secular movement as a whole, and I look at these online forums that you're talking about and things, and I see two deficits that I think we could get much more if we could add these things to our discussion, which I think you're trying to do here. An empathy deficit and a complexity deficit in the secular movement as a whole. And I want to address this to the ministers out there that might be watching or thinking about this. It's a very complex thing when your entire livelihood and your family and all that is wrapped up in your belief system. And coming out of that is extremely difficult. There's been a lot of personal cost for me. I'm still looking for employment and things. Luckily, I'm in a program where I'm getting some financial aid and able to study and do some things. But it's a complicated task to come out, and there's a lot of factors. There's not just the epistemic reasons of I believe this now, and this is the truth for me, and I need to just stand up for that. There's the pragmatic concerns of finances, of where are your family? Are you going to lose your family? Like people like Jerry DeWitt did. Are you going to lose your wife? Are you going to lose your kids? What's that kind of thing? And so I want to say to them, to you out there, I really empathize with that position. It's very, very difficult place to be in. And if you can find a way, it seems like the Clergy Project's moving toward trying to help folks find ways out, re-education grants, job networking, these kinds of things on the site recently. I've been glad to see some of these things beginning to emerge, having some mentors on the website as well. It's a really challenging thing to step out there. It takes immense courage, and we are with you, those of us who have come out that are in the Clergy Project, and I just want to communicate that.
Well, that is a very powerful communication. That's so full of compassion. We can hear it in your voice. You've been there, and you know as well as anyone how difficult it can be, but you can also speak to the rewards of getting out of something that you know isn't really good for you. So talk a little bit about the Clergy Project. Tell everyone how to find it on the web, and talk about what people will see when they visit that website.
Yeah, the Clergy Project, clergyproject.org or theclergyproject.org is the place to find that. I was one of the founding members. Dan Barker screened me in at the very beginning. I think there were 63 or 64 of us at the beginning a couple of years ago, and I believe there's over 500 now, ministers that have now found that and been screened into the program. And it's a place of support. Once you apply and someone calls and has a chance to have a conversation with you and screen you for the program, and if you get in, there are people there that can support you. There's online forums. You can ask questions. You can find support in difficult times. You're still in the pulpit.
And how anonymous is this?
Extremely anonymous. I mean, those of us who are out tend to have on the confidential sites have our full names, but those who don't have aliases or even their first names only, even inside the confidential site. And so it's extremely confidential. That is a core value of the program, and is something that's been developed through the support of the Dawkins Foundation and I believe Linda Lascola and others that did some research and found that there were those of us like me out there that have had our belief system change radically and needed a place that could be a safe haven for that.
What a terrific idea. And why don't you talk a little bit about the people originally behind it, people doing some of the research and people that were crucial to get this getting off the ground. I understand that Daniel Dennett was involved, also Richard Dawkins.
Yeah, the Dawkins Foundation, and as Linda Lascola, I believe is her name.
That's right.
Researcher, and they had found several people in their research, several ministers that had changed their belief system and were still in the pulpit at the time. And from that kind of came the brainchild to put something together, and they worked with Dan Barker and launched the site. And
that's Dan Barker of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, correct?
That's right. And so it's just grown monumentally, and women and men from all different faith traditions, from backgrounds in the clergy, are finding it to be an extremely helpful place to find support and networking and that kind of thing in a confidential manner.
Well, that is just terrific. What are some of the future hopes for the Clergy Project, and what do you think are some of the concrete goals that could be achieved looking ahead over the next few years?
I believe they have incorporated as a nonprofit, and the board's looking at various things. They sent out a survey within the last few months to kind of explore what direction to expand into. And I think there's hopefully going to be more job networking resources, more financial things like hopefully re-education grants for some folks. I think they had done the first one of those a few months ago. Those kinds of things, because those are tangible, pragmatic needs that so many have in order to just get out in their own identity and to feel like they can get out of the trap that you can feel in when you don't believe anymore, and yet you're having to do something for your livelihood. And I know that tears inside. I have a story that the moment I kind of figured out I didn't believe anymore. It was a very gradual process, but my position with the church here in Denver, Colorado was a year and a half and ended in 2008, which is when I deconverted. But it was that summer, right before I was in this interim position, that I realized that I didn't believe anymore. And the moment it was when I was on the platform,
Oh
um,
boy,
during
awkward.
a prayer, and I was like, how am I going to do this? And I like transitioned the prayer into more of a reading at the time. And then I went back to my chair. I'm like, I can't sing this hymn anymore. And so I was just standing there, just reading the hymn. And that was one of the most difficult summers I think I ever had, because I was still there in that position. And I'm like, I don't believe this anymore. What do I do? I mean, fortunately for me, I was stepping out of that interim position in August of '08. And so it was, there was a natural end to that for me. And it was, in some ways, that was a real blessing. So, but
Wow, what an amazing time. uh, Now, you have seen the Clergy Project just really explode in growth, maybe beyond some of the original hopes. But there doesn't seem to be any obvious limit to growth. What if you had to guess? Would you say that there are really very many agnostics or outright non-believers still behind the pulpits? Of course, it's impossible to even make any sort of accurate guess. But, we're at 500 something now. Could it be really 5,000? Could it be a significant percentage of ministers? What are you hearing? What do you think is the reality out there?
it's not a stagnant number, obviously, because it's constantly changing, especially in a culture where the web is penetrating these insulated cultures that so many of us grow up in. There's reading out there. There's education that challenges our belief systems. You can't stay away from the World Wide Web and the impact of reading and doing these things. And so ministers that are out there studying start challenging ideas and start thinking about things. It's going to shift. It's going to grow. Maybe there's hundreds. Maybe there's thousands. I don't know. But it has surprised me how fast it has grown. And I know there are many, I'm sure, that have gotten out of ministry or still in that haven't even joined the project yet. So
Sure.
I don't know for sure, but it's this one of the things I'm studying in my dissertation, or is the kind of insulated boundaries of certain subcultures, and the evangelical right subculture especially. And it's getting more difficult to maintain those boundaries because people can get to information outside of it, and you can't just insulate everybody from
Yeah,
that.
that's right. That's right. You
Places.
can't control what they see and read, and hence you can't control what they think about anymore.
Right.
So, talk a little bit more about your research specifically. What do you think needs to be investigated most? What are you focusing in on to sort of study the fundamentalist mind, if there is such a caricature?
Well, there are so many directions to go at where the evangelical right comes from. I mean, there's the psychological aspects, authoritarianism, or other things in psychology. There's the kind of political aspects of the intricacies of American politics and all the shutdowns we get and all the anyway. But I am looking at it primarily from a sociological perspective of looking at a subculture and how it has a moral worldview and how moral politics are delineated within it and what drives the politics of the group and makes the most predictive aspect of super conservative politics, culture war kind of politics in the United States, is the evangelical identity in all the surveys. If you identify yourself as evangelical, then you tend to identify yourself very clearly with these political strains. And so what I am looking at is, how does that subculture work? And basically, I'm looking at the concept of how ideology restricts the use of cultural tools, the choices that we can make if we have a toolbox of choices we can make in the society, then the more ideological your group is, the less tools you have to choose from that box.
That makes sense. That makes sense.
And so basically, the leaders in the evangelical right, as they teach theology, pastors as well as political leaders, create a sense of embattledness in the culture. And you see this around as they talk about President Obama and that symbol, and you see it as they talk about atheists, and they talk about, yes, a secular human, the enemies on the left, and all the communists, and all the stuff they talk about. It's language that's laden with this symbolic boundary that they're creating, and this embattledness. They primarily, in my dissertation, I'm talking about ideological frames that emerge. And let me be clear about what I'm saying. Things like moral purity and innocence, things like personal responsibility, things like obedience to God become the overarching themes in every avenue of the life. And so they basically take these theological themes and bring them over into the political world. And I basically argue that the symbol of the LGBT person, or they always say the homosexual, or the unborn child, become essentially ideal types of opposite polar symbols of purity and innocence, responsibility, obedience, these kinds of things.
Right.
And these are why these issues emerge as their key. Yeah.
Wow, that is fascinating. And I do think there is a lot of research, you're certainly aware of it, of trying to understand the conservative mind, but it's fueled by maintaining sharp in-group, out-group distinctions, certain kinds of purity tests, and it always seems to require an enemy, doesn't it?
Yes, always. That's how you get the dander up, and that's how you keep everyone embattled. And I've seen this. Is it Seth Andrews, the thinking atheist? He talks about. I heard him share one time that when he went from believing to non-believing and became an atheist, he went from being a person to a symbol of the enemy. And with some family members, for me, I've felt that profoundly. And that's kind of what I was communicating to those that are out there that haven't come out yet in that sense. It's like with some family members, I went to being a source of pride to a source of shame and that kind of thing, but we still maintain a relationship. With some family members, I went from being a person to a symbol of the enemy, and the ones that are most involved in politics. And then the other reward was I had family members that I'd never been that close to that have come out of the woodwork that may not share my belief system, but they've embraced me as new identity. So
that's wonderful. Amazing. So have you, give us a little hope here for the fundamentalists, because unlike them, we would never regard somebody as unsalvageable. So how can we communicate better with people who have gotten, as you say, sort of trapped in that framework that they didn't build, but they've kind of bought into it a little bit? How can we constructively talk to these people? How can we display some values where there's some common ground, where we don't have to feel like enemies anymore?
I think, and like I said, I don't want to step on too many postmodernist feet here.
No, please, there are no sacred cows here.
Please do it.
I do value. I value what I think there is a hunger for truth in many fundamentalists. I think there is a hunger for something real. And I think they just, from my perspective, are very misguided in what they see as authoritative in that hunt. And so Many of the Clergy Project members went straight from fundamentalism to atheism or agnosticism, and they didn't take the journey through all these different iterations. And so I think there's a common when I try to reach out to family members that may disagree, I say we have a common thirst for truth, and it's just how do we understand what is true, and I think helping them to question their assumptions by treating them as people and not as symbols.
Outstanding.
Not having
Outstanding.
that. So.
Well, we're going to wrap it up here, but time for some final thoughts. Chris, what would you like to sort of see where this is going? What would you like to say about the future here?
Well, I would like to see more people that engage in the bravery and honesty that Jeff is taking care of right now, because the bottom line is what he's doing is not just honest, it's very brave. To be in the situation that he's in right now and admit the things that he is admitting about his ideology to people that are in his environment that don't share that same opinion about ideology is very brave. And I think that he deserves credit for that.
Absolutely. You are a hero in a way, really, to all sides, if there are any sides.
And as far as in the future, I just want to see more people engage in this kind of honesty. I'd like to see more people engage in this kind of compassion, empathy, and complexity. And I'm hoping that this sets a trend, that this is a springboard towards more people doing this, that this increases exponentially.
Agreed, agreed. Let that be our final wish here. Thank you very much, Jeff Satterwhite, joining us from Denver, Colorado.
Thanks so much.
And thank you, Chris, for joining us. And thanks for everyone watching. This is the New Covenant Group, where we try to search for honesty in all of its forms and however it needs to be authentically expressed. This is John Shook, and thank you for joining us today.
Jeff, you did a great job.